Okay, so we're very grateful to Sujit to come today, Sujit Sivasundaram, who's stepped in to replace Fraser Watts, who unfortunately was unable to be with us as we'd hoped originally, but I think Fraser hopefully will be coming next term or the term after. And so Sujit stepped in very much at the last moment, and so we're doubly grateful to him for coming along. Sujit's from the history faculty here. He's also college lecturer and Director of Studies at Gonville and Caius College. And he's also had a book published by Cambridge University Press, which I warmly recommend. It's called Nature and the Godly Empire, Science and Evangelical Mission in the Pacific, 1795 to 1850. So I warmly recommend that book to you. But today, however, we're going to move from the Pacific and think particularly about India. And so Sujit is going to speak on William Carey and the Serampore College, Science and Religion in 19th Century India. So thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. It's wonderful to be here, and it's actually quite an honour to replace Fraser in some sense, because he first taught me as an undergraduate and supervised my undergraduate thesis when I was a philosopher as opposed to a historian, and I was working on philosophy of science and religion. Anyway, lots has happened since then, and this paper is related to this book, which Dennis has just mentioned, but it's actually in a very different geographical context. It's an attempt, I guess, to think through the relationship between missionary work and science at the start of the 19th century. So thank you very much for your invitation, and it's wonderful to be here, and I look forward to your comments as well. Okay. The separation of science and Christianity as discrete bodies of intellectual endeavour is alleged to be central to the emergence of modernity. Until recently, scholars cast modern science as a Western invention, which diffused with the winds of empires across the world, where it took seed and brought nourishment to all humanity in very literal terms, that too. Those who studied the spread of Christianity took a similar position in urging the transplantation of European values and beliefs wholesale by evangelists. These views have been decisively recast in recent times, but there has been little consensus on how to retell the story of the expansion, if you will, of science and Christianity, let alone how to relate science and Christianity in the non-European world. On the one hand, some scholars urge that modern science emerged out of a process of dialogue and exchange with local sciences of nature, the body and the sky in non-European lands. At the same time, historians of religion urge that Western Christianity was radically transformed by its encounter with non-European cultures and religions. However, there are others who provide a different emphasis in both these cases. Instead of stressing dialogue and reconstruction, they would urge power and cultural transformation. Accordingly, Western science and Christianity are some of the most potent ideological tools of imperialism, leading to the colonization of the mind and the reification of otherness. Now, late 18th century Britain saw the emergence of a spate of voluntary organizations of a moderately Calvinist inclination which sought to heed the call of Scripture and to commission missionaries to sail abroad. Amongst these, the Baptist Missionary Society, which was first formed in 1792 by a humble set of North Hampshire ministers, was the very first. These societies together oversaw the globalization of Protestantism with the rapid dispersal of missionaries to all corners of the globe. Though it's obvious that these missionaries preached the Bible, they often took other roles as well, as printers, agriculturalists, doctors, and naturalists. Indeed, in the early 19th century, missionaries were amongst the most important practitioners of Western science in the non-European world. Unlike army surgeons who ministered to just a select few, or traveling gentlemen who only spent a relatively short period overseas, Christian missionaries took up residence in the non-European world and in some cases spent the rest of their lives abroad. In addition to seeing their stations as fields for the study of nature, they also sought to educate local peoples in science. And in this way, they served as some of the earliest popularizers of Western science in the non-European world. So take Reverend William Carey, who had been a shoemaker and then turned to the ministry. and he might be credited as providing this sort of ballast to the formation of the Baptist Missionary Society. By November 1793, Carey, his wife, and children had landed in Bengal, where Carey was to spend 41 years. In order to support himself, Carey took up the position of manager at an indigo factory, and in his first letter from India, he asked for sickles, plough wheels, and seeds of flowers, fruits, and seeds for fruits and trees as well for his own garden. In 1800, he moved to the Danish settlement of Serampore, outside Calcutta, and this is a later image of South Serampore. And there, Carey established what was said to be the most impressive private botanical garden in Asia. So this paper describes the style of science practiced by Reverend William Carey and his closest collaborators, who together form the so-called Serampore trio, Reverend William Ward and Reverend Joshua Marshman as well. When viewed from Serampore, it appears that science and Christianity were intimately related civilizing missions. However, this paper reaches beyond this point to propose what historians of science might call an anti-diffusionist position. So the Baptist missionaries studied here did not bring Western science with them to Bengal in a very straightforward fashion, in a diffusionist fashion, if you will, to use the kind of history of science vocabulary, where science diffuses from Europe to Bengal. The science that they practiced in Bengal was distinct in several ways to that which emerged out of elitist institutions in London or from journals of gentlemanly travellers in India. Firstly, the missionaries sought to adopt Indian science and teach it at a college which they instituted in Serampore, alongside the teaching of European science. This allowed a certain amount of dialogue between different traditions of knowledge. At the Serampore College, Sanskrit astronomical traditions were taught alongside Copernican ones. However, this dialogue did not operate in a context where both these traditions were seen to be equally worthy, and that's a very important point to remember. By devoting themselves to the study of the allegedly lost sciences of India, the Serampore missionaries hoped to supersede that tradition of knowledge with true Christian science. Dialogue was therefore orchestrated and controlled for a specific purpose. Direction was exercised over the form of dialogue at Serampore College. So that's one sense in which this is a very kind of local manifestation, which is anti-diffusionist. Secondly, this paper is anti-diffusionist in urging that the genre of science that resulted in Serampore sought independence from the metropole, from London. In forming his own botanic garden at Serampore and in collaborating closely with the superintendents of the Calcutta Botanic Garden, and also in founding the Agricultural Society of India, Carey hoped to instruct European residents in India to take the lead in practicing science. Science practiced by residents was for Carey distinct and more effective than the kind of science done by mere travellers. Furthermore, Carey's network of correspondence, which served as a means of gathering natural historical specimens, was centred in Serampore and Calcutta, and its node in England was not in London as much as in the Midlands. And this is quite significant because lots of historians of science speak about networks of imperial science which radiate out of London and which are centred on London. And so what we can see is that the kind of missionary network is very, very different and has a sort of different geographical sort of layout, shall we say, and different kind of places act as centres. And it's actually kind of centred in India as opposed to London. So just a few introductory comments now on the status of missionaries in India in this period. Throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, missionaries were closely watched and controlled by the East India Company, who feared that they would aggravate local resistance by offending the religious sensibilities of Indians. So when the company's charter was debated in Parliament in 1793, the campaigns of Charles Grant and William Wilberforce had little effect, as their proposal that missionaries should be sent to India at company expense was rejected. Despite this kind of opposition from the company, missionaries, voluntary societies continued to send missionaries to India, and these evangelists eventually kind of got to India and then would prove their utility to the company in a very sort of pragmatic sense once they had got there, even though officially the company was not very kind of keen on promoting missionary work. So there was a sort of pragmatic policy of accommodation in India. However, because of the 1806 Vellore Mutiny, the climate became less forgiving. There were calls for all missionaries to leave India, and the Governor-General Minto imposed strict restrictions on both Anglican and dissenting missionaries. And this is why Danish safe havens like Tranquebar in the south, but also Serampore, which is a Danish safe haven in India, became a sort of safe haven for missionary activity outside the kind of scrutiny directly of the company. Finally, in 1813, a so-called pious clause was included in the company's charter, finally because of Wilberforce's campaigns in London. But even this, in real effect, made very little practical difference in India in promoting a sort of work of missionaries. So in Serampore, the generally unsympathetic attitude of the company meant that the trio had to ensure that the mission was self-sufficient throughout this period, and that the company was aware of its usefulness. And so these two factors are very important in trying to understand why the science practiced at Serampore was so localized. It was an attempt to prove its utility to the company and to make it a sort of a way in which the trio could earn some money to supplement, to balance out the accounts of the mission as well. So the missionaries at Serampore adopted a model of community life, borrowed largely from Moravians, which stressed that they should have everything in common and that no one should pursue business for his own exclusive advantage. So Carey acted as translator and agriculturalist in order to present the utility of his science to the company. And when Carey was first arrived, he hoped to obtain a position at the Calcutta Botanic Gardens, partly as a way of earning some money to supplement, to kind of provide for him as a missionary. In 1801, Carey was appointed professor of Sanskrit, Marathi and Bengali at the company's Fort William College, and this salary was also vital in balancing the mission's books. So the Serampore missionary science was intended as a financial safeguard. More personally, however, as Carey's network of correspondence demonstrates, and I'll be turning to this in a few minutes, the science practiced at Serampore was a means of cultivating proper habits of mind and body and resisting the dangers of disease and worldliness in a foreign land. So Carey's most erstwhile friends were in the Midlands, where the Baptist Missionary Society had blossomed. And in fact, they had a certain phobia of London and Baptist circles in London. And this is again why his correspondence network links up to the Midlands. So that's just sort of two comments to make sense of his correspondence network as well. So let me now turn to the body of this paper by starting with the typology of Carey's science and why I might term it a cautious Orientalism. And then I'll move on to an analysis of Carey's correspondence network and also the types of artifacts, natural historical specimens primarily, which he tried to collect and what this shows about his identity as a missionary and a man of science. And then we'll move on in the second half of the paper to Ward, another member of the trio, and Ward's work on Hinduism, and also to the Serampore College. So, in early 19th century Bengal, Reverend William Carey was the exemplary missionary who devoted himself to what might be termed constructive Orientalism, to use a term borrowed from recent scholarship on India. So, when William Roxburgh, shown here, the superintendent of the company's botanic gardens at Serampore, returned to Edinburgh in 1813 to recover from illness, Carey took upon himself the publication of two of Roxburgh's important unfinished works at the mission press at Serampore. The first of these is the Hortus Bengalensis, or Catalogue of Plants growing in the Honourable East India Company's Botanic Garden at Calcutta, which appeared in 1814, and also the Flora Indica, or Description of Indian Plants, published in 2 volumes in 1820 and 1824, respectively. So both the Hortus and the Flora Indica might be cast as works of Orientalist botany. Published in India, these works drew attention to the labours of botanists resident in India. In introducing the hortus, Carey noted that Europe's botanical knowledge could never have advanced without the repositories of plants in Asia, Africa, and America. He added that travelers and collectors had made many advances in botany. However, since such individuals spent so brief a time overseas, their findings were necessarily limited. This is a very controversial statement because at this time most of sort of botanical knowledge was published and was made credible by people who traveled and who brought back the information to London and then kind of became quite attached to various kind of scientific institutions in the metropolis. And so what Carey's doing here is actually kind of questioning that very fabric of the organization of botany by saying that in fact people in India could do their botany independently to some extent of what was going on in London. So if the community of Indian residents were encouraged in their botanical endeavors, and if the Calcutta Botanic Garden acted as the center for their researches, they would have in time the honor accorded of presenting to the public a list of plants, the far greater part of which were unknown to European botanists. And that's Carey's, that's a quotation from Carey's introduction to the hortus. So Carey proposed an elaborate network to support the botanical research of the company's garden. He instructed gentlemen in various parts of India to appropriate a small plot of ground for the reception of plants which grow wild in their neighborhood. Even whilst riding, they could apparently collect plants, and they could use their servants as helpers to carry on this act of collection. So they were asked to make a catalogue of these plants, but not to name them, because the naming of the plants should be carried out by an expert who perhaps was based at the Calcutta Botanic Garden. So basically it's important to realize that Carey had very close links with the Calcutta Botanic Garden, but he also had his own garden in Serampore. And if we just go back, we have Carey's house there. Let me see if I can get this to work. Yeah, over there. And Carey's garden over there. Right. So this is 20 miles outside Calcutta, and in some way Carey's garden could be seen as a sort of satellite to the company's garden. At the time, it was said to be, quote, second in extent only to the company's botanic garden. So soon after it was established in 1800, Carey wrote to Roxburgh that he had 427 species of plants growing in his garden, which was absolutely extraordinary, and invited Roxburgh to select any that he wanted for the company's garden. So there's a sense in which actually his garden at Serampore is a bit like the gardens that he's advising European residents in India to have for themselves, which would act as satellites to the Calcutta Botanic Garden and would then kind of send specimens in to the Calcutta Botanic Garden. So central to the operation of his garden was a team of Bengali gardeners or Malis, and this is an image from a later 19th century biography of Carey, and the author of this biography apparently interviewed this gardener who still could repeat all the Latin names of the plants that he had learned whilst a youth from Carey, which I think is quite significant in relation to thinking through Carey and training up this a body of apparently 50 gardeners who helped at his garden, which is just kind of gives you a sense of the extent of this garden and how much time and effort went into it. So Carey's use of Bengali gardeners as assistants is probably unsurprising when put into the context of his reliance on pundits in translation. So this is the most famous picture, I guess, of Carey with one of his pundits. Unfortunately, we have very few records in relation to these pundits and their background. We know various things about pundits later on in the 19th century in India, but not at this stage. One pundit that has left some traces in the historical record is his Marathi collaborator, Vaidyanath. So in 1801, Carey was appointed, as I've already said, professor of Sanskrit, Marathi, and Bengali at the company's Fort William College. And while working with Carey, Vaidyanath conducted these classes in Marathi. He translated a series of books into Marathi, which were later published under Carey's name. So in a sense, we need to sort of think about Carey's output in relation to publications and so on as a rising art of collaboration. Collaboration with pundits, but also in relation to his botany, actually coming out of collaborations with gardeners and all the various people who assisted him in Serampore. So the Hortus bengalensis and the Flora indica made use of local names. So Carey added various footnotes to Roxburgh's text, which he published from his press, you'll remember, which utilized his knowledge of Indian languages. So just to give you one instance of this, he heavily criticized another botanist who was resident in India, Francis Buchanan, because he had used a corrupt name for one of the plants from Nepal. Manko Koshi was the name that Francis Buchanan had used. And he said, this was one of the hundreds which might easily be produced of the mistakes which commonly occur when persons unacquainted, in some measure at least, with the languages set down words from the mouths of natives. Now, Manko Koshi means pleasure or delight to the mind. And so basically one needs to kind of think through Francis Buchanan off kind of collecting plants in Nepal with his guide, and he points to this plant, and the guide says, oh, isn't it a sort of delightful plant, etc. And he sort of takes this name down, and that becomes the name. But obviously there's sort of confusion in translation and in collaboration that arises from this. And so Carey is very, very keen to base his botanical knowledge and his botany to sort of to use his Indian language as an asset here, and to criticize people who don't do this. And this is another way in which we can think through what it means for missionary science to be localized in the non-European world. Now, at the same time, it's important not to overdo this point about localization and about Orientalism, because in fact Carey's devotion to botany also arose out of a concern with utility. And this is important in understanding why he was so committed to botany. So this concern with utility comes across in his pioneering role in setting up the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India. This association arose out of conversations, firstly with Lady Hastings, the Governor-General's wife. And it was really Carey's personal energy which led to the formation of this society. It became perhaps the second most prominent society in India after the Royal Asiatic Society. It devoted itself to experiments on different soils, the rotation of useful crops, the introduction of new techniques in relation to livestock, the implements of agriculture, drainage of wastelands, etc. So Carey's botany and agriculture can perhaps be labeled as an early manifestation of constructive Orientalism. His was an Orientalism constrained by a degree of utility and in a profound belief that European knowledge and technique could alter the happiness of the country. So in using this term Orientalism, I'm thinking about this debate in the scholarship about the connection between Orientalism and Anglicism as rival policies in early 19th century India, where Orientalism is a devotion to India and Indian language, and using pundits and so on, and Anglicism is bringing in English language and English modes of education. So we can see how Carey's botany is somewhere halfway between these two extremes, but that it shares very many features with the Orientalist camp. And we could think through this in relation to his membership of the Royal Asiatic Society, which is the kind of place where Orientalism flourished, and his role as a translator, and his role at Fort William College. But at the same time, we can think about how he's concerned with utility and with improvement as well, which is a more kind of Anglicist program of activities. Right, so having surveyed what might be the typology of Carey's science, I'm now going to turn a little bit more to his own identity and to his own sort of personal network of correspondence, shall we say, and how science fits into this. And the claim that I'm making here is that his network of correspondence shows how he cultivated a very sort of godly and familial science, a science which was linked to the formation of sort of godly family values, and how he was hoping to make Serampore and Calcutta botanical centers by gathering a sort of vast network of correspondence. His many surviving letters to his son, Jabez, is that the way you say his name? Jabez, yes, who was first a missionary in Abonya, close to Java, and then in Ajmer in India, often contain whole paragraphs devoted to natural history. And this is quite striking. I was really surprised to see how much natural history there is in this correspondence between the father and the son. This is January 1815, and he says, everything living which you sent by the first conveyance, this is Carey Senior,
died before the ship's arrival. The shells, however, were very welcome present, and I hope you'll continue to send more, send ugly ones as well as beautiful ones. In short, some of every sort you can procure, etc. And there's a whole kind of list of things which he wants. The letter goes on in this vein, precise instructions on how he should pack stuffed birds, how to prevent the kind of depredations that result from cockroaches and mice, really precise instructions on how to send natural history specimens from close to Java back to India. So Carey also passed on his interest in natural history to his eldest son, Felix, who at times was the rebel of the family. He also, in addition to these two sons, passed on his interest in natural history to the wider family in England. So he wrote to his sisters, for instance, that he was greatly pleased that his sisters' children were, quote, inclined to gardening, and that they were sending him seeds and roots. When one of his nephews emigrated to South Africa, Carey was delighted in a new source of specimens. Now, one way of interpreting Carey's use of his family as collectors is to stress the role of that natural history played in forging godly habits at home. So Carey's letters to his son often urged the serious use of all of his resources in a manner fit for a Christian, so as to avoid the supposition caught from men of the world that Jabez was lax or carnal or conformed to the world. So a constant source of anxiety for Carey was the opposite of self-improvement, which he sometimes identified in Jabez's wife, Eliza. So in 1815 he wrote to Jabez, "Tell Eliza that I expect her to dry seeds for me and butterflies, also to pick up stones, shells and crabs." In later letters, the reason why he said this becomes clear. He's very concerned with what he says is Eliza's finery. So he advises his son that his wife should not devote herself to her appearance, she should collect natural history specimens instead. So Christian self-improvement necessitated careful circumspection and the clarification of gender roles as well. And the study of nature provided the perfect context for someone to be serious, to be godly, and to be devoted to the improvement of a whole family. At the same time, this act of collecting specimens, gathering specimens for the family, in some sense reminded Carey of his far-flung family, right? So he wrote to Jabez, for instance, "Every shell or plant puts me in mind of you." So in effect, it was an act of remembrance, an exercise in remembrance. So that's an important point to keep in mind as well. So Carey's natural history also helped him conceptualize his views of health and its relation to contentment. So an article in The Friend of India, which is a Serampore periodical, which may have been written by him, provided a commentary on how to preserve the body from the effects of the Indian climate. The author wrote that a spirit of dissatisfaction with India could generate illness. When therefore the country, its climate, its productions, its inhabitants are unhappily regarded with aversion, the effect of this on the spirits, the digestive system, the digestive powers and the system in general cannot fail of being injurious. So the writer advised that instead of being discontented with India, that residents in India should throw themselves into intellectual activity within India, and that would improve India. He suggested that his readers undertake some heroic undertaking which shall find full employment for the mind. And so this is a very kind of interesting way of contextualizing Carey's devotion to natural history as well, as a way of coming to terms with the tropical climate and as a way of resisting its impact on the body. The typical Orientalist, in one of his early letters, he wrote that his own frame agreed better with the Indian climate than the British one, and concluded, "I never was better in my life." There are lots of tragedies in his own family and also in the wider Serampore mission, but despite this, Carey's letters contain what is perhaps a positive optimism about improving the health of residents in India and improving the health of Indians as well. So for Carey, nature as manifested in the animal, vegetable and human worlds could be preserved from decay, and botany and medicine served as intellectual enterprises that aided him in this aim. And so in a sense, all the kind of instructions about how to pack, how to preserve specimens, how to collect, how to kind of bring things together in a botanical garden, all of this comes in here as well as a way of improving nature and bettering it.
which is very much one of the reasons why natural history was so popular in this period. Now, I mentioned earlier that I want to make the point that, in fact, the nodes in this correspondence network are somewhat different to those which characterize imperial, sort of official scientific network, shall we say, which might center on people like Joseph Banks, the naturalist who traveled with Captain Cook and who went back to London and then became president of the Royal Society, and who was presided over this huge network of people who collected botanical specimens in the early 19th century. And then there are people who follow on and take up the Banks legacy as well, and who preside over this network of imperial collection. Now, why this is significantly different is because Carey is, on the one hand, using his family, but this is a very intriguing correspondence, which has just come to light, I think. And it's with Roland Hassel, who is one of the first missionaries who was sent on board the Duff by the London Missionary Society to Tahiti. So the Serampore missionaries start corresponding with Hassel, and Carey asks him to send various specimens from the South Pacific and from New Holland by this time, which is where he is, to Serampore. So one could see how the missionary network, this is very suggestive. We don't have other pieces of correspondence like this, unfortunately, but perhaps there were other contacts like this which allowed the collection of specimens as well. So he writes, "I'm very fond of natural history, particularly of botany, and have made a large collection of plants from different parts of the world which are flourishing at the mission garden at Serampore. You will greatly oblige me by sending me some seeds, bulbous or fibrous roots, as you may be able. A few shells, corals, and seed would also be a very acceptable present, as with small specimens of the stones of New Holland. Your weeds will be beautiful flowers here, and your saffroots grateful. So much the more as coming from brethren employed in the same work, whom we should remember, point about memory, whensoever we behold the productions of New Holland." So Carey's network obviously had these kind of very widely dispersed collectors, but it also had links to the Midlands. And so he sends back specimens to lots of his Midlands friends. I'm trying to find the list of people now. Because he'd grown up in the Midlands, or he'd been Baptist minister in the Midlands before arriving in Bengal. It's very striking that there is no correspondence between Sir Joseph Banks and Carey, though there is some correspondence between another eminent botanist, William Hooker, and Carey. But even with Hooker, who's a very eminent botanist, Carey sends back his specimens through his friends in Liverpool, and also at one point he has the audacity to actually question Hooker's skills as a botanist and to say that he's got one of his names wrong because he doesn't understand Indian language, etc. And that's very striking. It's not the kind of thing you do with an eminent botanist in this period. So from Carey's letters that survive, it's clear that he corresponded more regularly and exchanged specimens more freely with his Midlands correspondence than with the likes of Hooker or Banks. In relying on provincial collectors, Carey could improve his own collection and so create an alternative network to that which was centered on London and which Banks and Hooker presided over. So he had people sending specimens from England, America, South Africa, Australia, Assam, Sylhet, Burma, Nepal, etc., just to note those that have survived in the historical record. So Carey was not the only Serampore missionary who was interested in science. His colleague, William Ward, paid particular attention to the status of ancient texts on astronomy and medicine in his account of the writing, religion, and manners of the Hindus, which was one of the most important early accounts of Hinduism. Ward, like Carey, had a lowly background. He'd been a printer, the editor of a provincial newspaper, the Hull Advertiser, before travelling to India in 1796. It's important to state that his account of Hinduism is based almost wholly on observation of Hinduism in Bengal, though he obviously kind of generalizes in the text more widely. So by analysing Ward's commentary on science, it's possible to consider further the view of Indian scientific traditions held by Serampore missionaries, and the way in which this sort of attention to Indian scientific traditions sort of worked in parallel and sometimes even collided with the attention to European scientific traditions. So central to Ward's book is the cliched Orientalist thesis that the ancient texts under discussion suggest a connection between India and the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. So the bulk of his work is devoted to narrating the various gods of the Hindus. So in trying to explain why the Hindus have such striking forms of divinity, Ward tried to come up with a theory of why this might be, and he said perhaps it was a way of actually teaching science to the populace, but then he kind of quickly dismissed that as a theory as well. Instead, he took the view that Hindu notions of their gods were formed by kings who wanted to gratify rather than instruct the populace. They were said to teach popular sentiments rather than profound mysteries. So very crucial to Ward's view of the gods of the Hindus is his natural theology, or his theology of nature, if I could use the kind of latter term, which is this view of nature as designed as something which is very crucial for Christians to meditate on. So nature was not God, but rather it referred to God. And this was what he was keen to criticize the Hindus as having confused. Those who confused nature with God would never reach profound knowledge. Right, so Ward wrote how every Protestant nation bore testimony to how idols were unnecessary. And so his rebuttal of, or his use of this sort of philosophy of images came in line with the rebuttal of Roman Catholicism as well. So Ward surveyed Indian views of astronomy and medicine in 2 separate chapters in his account, and he was very keen to stress the role of astrology, for instance, as a gross superstition, as a way in which Hindus had actually kind of confused nature and come to a very kind of irrational view of nature. He also considered medicine, and again suggested that the kind of classical medicine had gone into decline in later times. So Ward's views might be taken as typical of those held at the Serampore mission. They demonstrate that in engaging with Indian science, the Baptists hoped to recover the truths of what they saw as ancient wisdom, which had since been lost because India had degenerated, had gone into the hands of corrupt kings, etc. The supposedly corrupt sciences of contemporary India had emerged out of popular Hinduism, which would then be replaced, if studied properly, by proper rational Christian science with time. And central to this survey of Indian science was the articulation of a particular mode of vision. Hindus worship nature without understanding what it pointed to. Now, very central to understanding this sort of the placement of Indian science within the Serampore mission and the way in which it was seen as an important thing to study and to teach, as well as a stepping stone to the propagation of Christian science and to the opening up of the possibility of conversion, is the college at Serampore. So it stood on the banks of the Hooghly, which we saw earlier in the first image. It dates from 1822, this building that is. The college was first instituted in 1818. And the prospectus for the college in its first year gives a very kind of clear idea of what its aim was supposed to be. Called Instruction of Asiatic Christians and Other Youths in Eastern Literature and European Science at Serampore, Bengal. At the end of its first year, the college had admitted 37 students, 19 of whom were said to be of Christian families, 14 quote of Hindu caste, and 4 alleged to have no caste or religion. So the trio hoped to bring Christian education, if we call it that, to a cross-section of youth from different backgrounds, and so to create what they called a class of Christian pundits, people who were learned with classical texts, who could then basically act as missionaries and who could then debate with other learned men in India. So the trio were keen to attend to the history of the early church and its encounter with Greek philosophy. The early apostles, it was said, were well acquainted with classical learning, and little was necessary beside a good natural understanding to compare the theology and ethics of classicism with that of the gospel of Christ. So in India too, in this period, they urged that it was important that people studied classical texts and that they could use classical texts in a Christian context. And so the teaching of Indian science fell along aside this. So at the completion of the first year, the Serampore College had already made some progress in the teaching of both Indian and European science. 9 Brahmins had attached themselves to the college for the sake of making themselves acquainted with Western astronomy and geography. So it was a kind of Brahmins wanting to study European science would come to the college. And they studied the Leelavati as well, the 12th century treatise written by the Indian mathematician Dr, in addition to taking courses in European, or lectures in European astronomy as well. So we see the two going side by side at this time. So just a quotation from the first report of the Serampore College, which gives us this idea that everything in India which is scientific should be adopted by Christian missionaries and then improved on. So in a sense that it could be a stepping stone on to Christian science. All the science they really have ought to be preserved and not a particle of it lost. If they have carried the study of any branch of knowledge beyond us, this circumstance ought to be acknowledged and improved. If they have merely trodden in the same path, the knowledge of the science they really have will enable us to take it up where they fail and carry it to its proper extent, while the ideas they now possess and the terms in which they express them will facilitate the communication of superior ideas. By the end of the second year, the Serampore mission reported that they had appointed Reverend John Mack as professor of the college, and it became clear that his teaching at the college would basically, primarily at the start anyway, involve the sciences. Mack arrived in Calcutta, and his lessons in science were intended to diffuse a sort of scientific mode of vision. I'll explain what I mean by that. Mack brought with him a series of astronomical instruments, and then a whole set of instruments was bought by the college in the following year from Edinburgh. And here we have this list, and I'll just give you kind of closer look at some of this. You just get an idea of the extent to which, how many scientific instruments there were in this college. It's quite striking. There was so much. In explaining the grand object of his lessons, the missionaries noted that it was the diffusion among the natives of a species of knowledge which lays open the real nature of the material objects they so blindly worship. So those Indians who witnessed scientific experiments were expected to understand that the material that had been used to create their gods was actually something that could be experimented on, that could be decomposed and formed again at the pleasure of man. So it was this idea of changing the way Hindus saw and the importance of sight in relation to nature as a sort of prerequisite for conversion. So a whole series of science textbooks are also published in Serampore in the years that follow. And that's just an indication of some of those texts. These are periodicals which are published in Serampore, which also carry a lot of science in this period. Just to give you an indication of what these books look like, we would have a page of English on one side and a page of Bengali on the other side. So you'd kind of have sort of text side by side, and it's all coming out of the Serampore press, mostly anyway. And it usually takes this form of a dialogue. So this is the dialogue which is right at the start of William Yeats's Elements of Natural History and Natural Philosophy. What may I expect from contemplating the works of nature? The pupil says, the tutor says, both pleasure and profit as God has formed the eye to behold the beauties of nature. It must be both as agreeable and useful employment. Is not greater learning necessary for this study than I at present possess? By no means. The peasant, as well as the philosopher, may partake of this pleasure. A moderate share of knowledge is sufficient. The creation is open to the view of all. It only requires observation and reflection of what is the universe composed of matter and spirit, and it goes on like this. I think this is quite an interesting start to this text, because obviously it brings this sort of idea of vision, the fact that nature is open, the creation is open to the view of all, and that everyone can reflect on it, and that it's not necessary to have greater learning. Everyone can do this. So the Serampore College was a site for the study of both Indian and European science. In devoting themselves to these traditions of learning, the missionaries at Serampore acted as mediators between European and Indian science. However, they did not hold that both of these systems of knowledge deserved equal weight. From, in a sense, one would set the context for the adoption of the other, i.e. Christian Science. And also at the college it's important to perhaps note, and I can say more of this if you're interested in it, that the college moves from a very Orientalist position, where there's lots of attention to classical text, to a more Anglicist one by about the 1830s, and that's quite significant. Right, now what about the reception of this kind of program, science and scientific learning on the part of Indians? I just want to give you a quick story and then conclude. In 1817, the periodical accounts of the Serampore mission announced that Rama Mohan Raya, quote, a very rich Brahmin in Calcutta, had visited the missionaries. Quote, he has published in Bengali 1 or 2 philosophical works from the Sanskrita, which he hopes may be useful in leading his countrymen to renounce idolatry. Now, the precise nature of Ram Mohan Roy's relations with the missionaries is in doubt. It's certain, however, that from 1816 he worked very closely with the Serampore missionaries. For instance, in the second report of the college, the missionaries expressed their thanks to Roy for the gift of a complete set of publications, his publications, for their library. Roy was the only Indian that was thanked there. Other Europeans had gifted telescopes, 18-inch globes, and other scientific instruments, just to give you an idea of what kinds of things were being gifted to the college at this time. At this time, i.e. 1816, Ward could write that Roy's career demonstrated that the knowledge of European science and the practice of idolatry are incompatible. So, in a sense, Roy had embraced European science, and that was very crucial in him being a Christian. But in reality, something far more complicated was going on here, because in fact Roy was effectively a syncretist who combined various Christian traditions with Hindu traditions as well. And by the 1820s, a virulent and public controversy had erupted between Roy and the missionaries over the divinity of Christ and the doctrine of the Trinity. Central to the fallout was Roy's book, The Precepts of Jesus, 1820, which resulted in a stream of criticism on the part of the missionaries in the Friend of India. Essentially, Roy appealed to reason, and he said that Trinitarianism was a form of Christian polytheism, a bit like Hindu polytheism. So, in a sense, this is a very complicated story, but I want to suggest that Indian agency needs to be taken into account here, and the straightforward adoption of European scientific traditions needs to be qualified in this story. So a few conclusions very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time. Ram Mohan Roy's reconstruction of the Serampore missionaries' scientific worldview raises a question. Where does authority lie in the story? The Serampore missionaries sought to change the beliefs of their pupils, pundits, and gardeners. But if Roy's response is taken to be indicative, and perhaps it's not, it's plausible that they did not always succeed in this. But Roy's response and reaction should not lead to the stipulation of a mere dialogue between European sciences and Indian sciences. The fact remains that from Serampore, the missionaries oversaw profound changes in agriculture, in botany, and in the teaching of sciences. And this must be kind of taken on board even as we think about Indian agency and the ways in which Indians actually kind of recast this whole account. In noting the alterity of missionary science, i.e. how it's very different to elite botany, if we will, it has also been my intention to suggest that the network of the Serampore missionaries' activities had different nodes to that which characterized colonial botany in this period, linked up to the Midlands, but also centered in Serampore. And one way in which we can come to terms with this localization is by thinking through how the Baptist missionaries were trying to be self-sufficient. They were trying to disconnect themselves financially from the Metropolitan Baptist Missionary Society as well. I've also stressed the role of vision in this paper. Lots of historians who work on colonial science have been concerned with the role of vision and the way it's placed in relation to colonialism. So the missionaries hoped to change the way Indians saw and the meanings that Indians attached to the natural world, moving from a confusion of nature with the divine to a referential view of nature. And we can see this worked out, for instance, in Ward's book on Hinduism. Ultimately, it's been my aim in this paper to point attention to how Christianity and science could be combined in early 19th century India. From the post-Darwinist perspective of the later century, this seems a really quite surprising contention, because obviously the missionaries and the scientists go in very different ways. But in fact, missionaries were one of the prime agents in the globalization of knowledge in the early British Empire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sujit, for that great coverage. So we have some time now for questions. Who wants to be the first? Some questions and comments as well, perhaps. Yes, over here at the back.
If I remember rightly, Carey did not get support to go to India in the first place very easily. Is that right? And if that's the case, how did that vary through his lifetime, the attitude in England to him out there?
Well, actually, he had very little support from India, from England even, and he had to basically. I mean, there was a huge controversy in relation to funding and so on. Later on, was in the later years of his life, between the Baptist missionaries in Serampore and those based in London, and also there was a whole kind of question about whether they should be wholly independent and self-supporting. So basically, the idea was that they should be self-supporting. And there was, as far as I can make out, there's very little in terms of financial support going from England to India. So I think somebody else might correct me because they might know more about this. But basically, this is why he had to do all this sort of botany to some extent. This is why he was involved in agriculture as well. There was once a time, for instance, where he wanted to buy a huge amount of land for the mission and grow timber, for instance, as a way of supporting the missionaries when they were going through very hard times. So it was very self-supporting.
There's a question
here. Yeah, perhaps I should declare an interest in your talk this evening, this afternoon, because having been Baptist missionaries working in Asia.
You've been one?
Yes.
Great. Yeah.
Teaching electronics to Hindu students.
Yes. Yeah, so you fit into this story.
Yes.
Sort of
yes,
50 years' time, somebody will come along and write about you. Yes.
And William Carey then is one of our heroes.
Yes.
The point I was going to make, really a comment, is that in the correspondence you will notice, of course, that there was opposition for what he was doing in India, because people thought he ought to be, as a Christian missionary, going preaching the gospel and teaching people languages and plants and all that sort of thing didn't fit in with their view. And I could reinforce that really, even today, that there are people, what was I doing teaching electrical engineering to Hindu students, is what we're supposed to do. But those two are not incompatible. I could tell you many stories of how you can preach the gospel by doing very practical things like that. So.
Yeah, I think it's a very important debate internally within the missionary organisation, within missionary organisations right through the 19th century, about the connection between what might be civilization and conversion, as they would articulate it. So, do you civilize or do you proclaim the gospel? And various different missionary organisations sit in various points on that kind of debate, and also. Various missionaries themselves adopt distinct ways of kind of bringing these two things together. Yeah.
Sorry, the question down here. Sorry. Sorry. Thank you.
I was wondering how significant you thought Carey's distinctive Calvinistic theology was in his anti-diffusionist, as you termed it, approach to Christianity and science. Do you see that the Calvinism that I suppose really was the pulse beat of Carey's religion was significant in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably need to work more on that in relation to bringing in the sort of theological framework. But I would definitely think it was, because in a sense it's kind of devoting. I mean, what does it? I mean, do you work on Calvinism or do you? No.
I think in terms of Carey would have a world view that would be all-encompassing and not discrete, and therefore his approach would be quite antithetical in a sense to what was going on in London. He'd want to be far more embracive, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and God has universal dominion, not an inch of ground is Jesus Christ not Lord over. So those distinctive Calvinistic emphasis with perhaps...
No, those all ring bells, actually. And I think what's very striking about this kind of missionary activity is that it's very kind of universal, in the sense it's trying to kind of create a whole kind of type of science, which is completely independent of, say, elite science. And so, yes, there's a sense in which missionaries can do better science than kind of ungodly naturalists and so on. But there's a sense in which they can create a network, they can create kind of a body of information, which is more authoritative because they are Christian. And so that degree of confidence in Christian science is very striking right across the missionaries, which I think that kind of would fit in quite well with the Calvinist.
Could I just ask a question which is connected? I mean, it seems very Baconian science in a way that they were kind of disseminating. Is that the case? I mean, it's collecting things, it's classifying. Were they suspicious of theorizing? Did they see that as something to be concerned about? Or to what?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And I guess at the time, in relation to how natural history works, the distinction between collection, field work, and theorizing is starting to be very fundamental. So people in London are theorizers, and people out in the field aren't supposed to name specimens because they get into trouble if they do, and they must check with the kind of theorizers before they do that. I think there's a sense of that in Carey's work as well, but I think for him the theorizers are in Calcutta as opposed to in London. And he is also theorizing himself in relation to the way he can name and so on. I mean, I guess for botany, theory probably, I mean, philosophical botany, I guess, is about naming this period and distinguishing species and so on. So if I could take theory as indicating that for this science, then I think he kind of positions himself in that way. But as I mentioned briefly, other Europeans in India should not name because they don't have the expertise to do that. They should just collect. Yeah, Jason.
The quote that you put up from the first report of the college in 1890 was very interesting.
Yeah.
Because it shows the really collaborative element that you're emphasizing, that they're trying to recover the kind of Prisca sapientia within Indian science. And so they seemed to be open to that idea in the science, but when it came to Christianity, it seems like they needed to import classical antiquity as the foundation for teaching Christianity, rather than also recognizing maybe a Prisca sapientia there in that native Oriental culture that might provide something new for them in understanding Christianity. Do you see a differing attitude in the way that they collaborate on the science, but less in terms of their propagation of Christianity?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I haven't worked on the sort of conversion stories and so on, but I get the sense that there too they're trying to work with Brahmins and so on, and to convert Brahmins, and then to get them to go out and preach the gospel. So I do get a sense that they're collaborating there as well. But
did they,
I'm not,
was there any sense that they could learn something about Christianity by recovering the ancient ideas there?
Right.
That might have preserved something.
I haven't got that sense.
Okay.
No.
Well, Vishnu has great similarities to Jesus. The legends thereof.
I'm afraid our time is up, but I'm sure that you can carry on discussion afterwards if Sujit can stay around for a little while. So thank you very much again, Sujit, for a great talk and a good discussion. So thank you.